I looked at my watch the moment my son pressed that folded napkin into my hand. Not because I was checking the time, because 63 years of living had taught me that when a grown man passes his father a note at a celebration dinner instead of saying the words out loud, something has already gone wrong that words alone can't fix. The note had 3 words on it. Just 3. Written in my son's handwriting, the same handwriting I'd watched form its first crooked letters on lined paper back in 1989. She's not real. I slipped the napkin into my jacket pocket. I picked up my fork. I smiled at the woman sitting across the table from me, my son's wife of 14 months, and I said something pleasant about the salmon, and she smiled back with that particular smile she had, the one that never quite reached the corners of her eyes. And I thought, yes, I know exactly what you are. But let me go back to the beginning. Because this story didn't start at that dinner table. It started the way most quiet disasters start, with something that seemed, at the time, like very good news. My name is Douglas Hartwell. I spent 31 years as a commercial litigation attorney in Hamilton, Ontario, and before that I articled under one of the sharpest minds in contract law this province has ever produced. I've reviewed more documents than I can count. I've sat across the table from people who lied to my face with complete confidence, and I've learned the expensive way, on behalf of clients, that the most dangerous lies are the ones dressed in exactly the right clothes. I'm 63 years old. My wife, Patricia, passed away 4 years ago after a long illness that we handled together the way we handled everything, quietly, as a team, without asking for more sympathy than we needed. She was the kind of woman who made every room feel organized simply by being in it. Her absence left a silence in our house in Ancaster that I have never fully learned to furnish. My son, Marcus, was 29 when his mother died. He took it hard in that particular way that men of his generation take things hard, by insisting he was fine, by working longer hours, by calling me every Sunday evening and spending the first 10 minutes of every call talking about anything except what was actually on his mind. He's 33 now. He works in commercial real estate development, handles mid-sized projects across the Hamilton-Toronto corridor, and until 14 months ago, I would have said he was navigating grief about as well as anyone could ask. Then he met Simone Vaillancourt. She was introduced to me on a Tuesday evening in late October, 13 months before the dinner I'm telling you about. Marcus brought her to a restaurant in downtown Hamilton, his choice, a place we'd been going to together since he was in university, and she walked in wearing a dark green coat and a particular kind of composure that I recognized immediately. Not the composure of a calm person, the composure of a person who has practiced being calm in situations that require it. She was 31, she said, originally from Montreal. She'd moved to the Hamilton area 18 months earlier for work. She was a project coordinator for an architecture firm, she said, though she was vague about the firm's name in a way I noticed but didn't press. She spoke English with a very faint French-Canadian inflection that was genuinely charming. She laughed at the right moments. She asked me thoughtful questions about my career. By the end of dinner, Marcus was looking at her the way he used to look at his mother when he was very young, with complete and uncomplicated trust. That look on my son's face was the most dangerous thing I saw all evening. I drove home and sat in the kitchen for a long time after. Patricia would have known immediately what was wrong. She had an instinct for people, a quiet alarm system I never fully possessed. I had training. She had something better. And that night, sitting alone at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, what I had was a feeling I couldn't yet name, and a name I couldn't yet verify. Simone Vaillancourt. I didn't do anything with that feeling right away. I want to be honest about that. I told myself I was being the cautious, slightly cold father that widowed men become when their sons start moving on. I told myself Patricia would have told me to give the woman a fair chance. I went to bed. I woke up the next morning and went to my office and billed 6 hours and didn't think about it. But I saved the name. They were engaged by February. 4 months. I know how that sounds. I thought the same thing. I sat Marcus down in the living room, the same room where he'd watched hockey with me growing up, where Patricia and I had told him about her diagnosis, where this family had done all its serious talking, and I said, as carefully as I knew how to say it, "This is fast, Marcus." He said, "Dad, I know, but I've never been more certain about anything." And then he said something that I've thought about many times since. He said, "She makes me feel like Mom is still watching out for me." I didn't say what I was thinking. I said I was happy for him. I shook his hand and then pulled him into a hug because he needed it, and because I needed it, and because some things are more important than being right. But I went home that night, and I opened my laptop, and I started doing what I should have done in October. Here is what I found, and what I didn't find. Simone Vaillancourt, 31, from Montreal. There was a LinkedIn profile, created 11 months earlier. A thin digital footprint, no Facebook older than 2 years, an Instagram account with 340 followers, and photographs that began abruptly in January of that year, with no earlier history. An architecture firm in Burlington that, when I called the main number and asked to be connected to their project coordination department, had no record of anyone by that name. I called back and asked whether they'd ever had a project coordinator by that name. A pause. Then, I'm sorry, I can't confirm or deny personnel information. That's a very specific answer. It's not, I've never heard of her. It's something else. I hired a private investigator. His name is Gary Pelletier, and I've used him twice over the years for due diligence on opposing parties in litigation. He's methodical, discreet, and he charges accordingly. I told him what I needed, and I wired him the retainer, and I went back to behaving like a normal father while I waited. The wedding was set for the following September. Marcus asked me to give a speech. I said yes, and I meant it whatever I found or didn't find. That boy was my son, and I would stand up at his wedding and mean every word I said about him. But I also quietly asked my real estate lawyer to advise me on certain asset protection structures, because 31 years in litigation teaches you that love and preparation are not mutually exclusive. Marcus co-owned with me a commercial property in Stony Creek, a small strip mall that Patricia and I had bought as an investment in 2003. It wasn't worth a fortune, but it wasn't nothing. Marcus also had a modest but real estate portfolio of his own, built over 6 years of careful work. Whatever Simone Vaillancourt was or wasn't, I wanted the structures in place before any ceremony happened. Marcus found out I'd talked to a lawyer. Not from me, from a mutual acquaintance in the real estate community who'd run into my lawyer at a conference and mentioned it in passing. Marcus called me on a Wednesday evening, and he wasn't angry exactly, but he was hurt, and hurt in Marcus is more difficult to navigate than anger. He said, "You're trying to protect the properties from Simone." I said, "I'm trying to make sure our family's assets are handled carefully, the way your mother and I always handled them." He said, "You don't trust her." I said, "I don't know her well enough yet to trust her the way this situation requires." There was a long silence. Then he said, "Gary Pelletier called Simone's former roommate in Montreal. Did you know that? She told Simone someone was asking questions about her past." And here is what I learned from that conversation. Simone had a former roommate in Montreal who knew enough about Gary Pelletier's inquiry to warn her, which meant she had been expecting someone to ask questions. I thought about that for a long time. Gary's report came back 6 weeks before the wedding. I read it twice at my office, door closed, no calls held. Then I read it a third time. Simone Vaillancourt had a previous marriage. She was not 31 years old. She was 36, born in Longueuil, and her legal name at birth was Sylvie Marchand. She had changed her name through a legal process in Quebec in 2019. The name change was legitimate, entirely legal, properly filed, but the reason for it was not something she had volunteered to Marcus. The reason, as best Gary could determine, was that Sylvie Marchand had been the subject of a civil judgment in Quebec in 2018. A former business partner had successfully sued her for breach of fiduciary duty in connection with a small property investment company they had co-founded. The judgment was for $47,000. It had never been satisfied. The previous marriage had ended in divorce in 2017. The ex-husband was a man named François Letourneau, currently living in Gatineau. Gary had spoken to him briefly. Letourneau had said only, "I hope the new man is very careful with what he signs." There was more. The architecture firm in Burlington had employed a Simone Vaillancourt, but only on a short-term contract basis. 3 months, the previous year. She had listed it as a full-time, ongoing position on her LinkedIn profile and in conversation. I sat with this information for 48 hours. I thought about how to use it. Not whether to use it I knew I had to tell Marcus, but how. Because the version of my son who had told me that Simone made him feel like his mother was still watching out for him was not a son who would easily accept a folder of documents as the language of love. He would hear it as attack. He would position himself between me and her, the way people do when they've decided that loyalty to a partner means defending them from all evidence to the contrary. I needed Marcus to see it himself, not to be told, to see. I invited them both to dinner. My house, my kitchen, the place where this family had always done its real talking. I made the meal myself, a habit I'd developed after Patricia died, because cooking gave me something to do with my hands during the hours when the silence in the house was loudest. I made roast chicken and roasted vegetables. I opened a bottle of Ontario Red that Marcus likes. I set the table the way Patricia used to set it for important evenings, with the good dishes and the cloth napkin. Simone arrived, wearing the dark green coat again. I noticed that. I also noticed that she noticed me noticing, and that she smiled in response, not a warm smile, but an assessing one, calibrated very precisely to look warm. We ate. We talked. I asked her careful questions about her work and her background, and I watched her answer them with the fluency of someone who has told a practice story many times. She was good. She was genuinely very good. If I hadn't had Gary's report, I would have found no specific crack to point to. It was all smooth surface. Near the end of the meal, I said conversationally, "The way you mentioned something you've just remembered, Simone, I ran into someone this week who said they went to school in Longueuil around the same time you would have. Did you grow up there, or was that Montreal proper?" 2 seconds of silence. That was all. 2 seconds, which is 1 second longer than a person who grew up in Longueuil would need to answer that question. She said, "I moved around a bit as a child. I always say Montreal because it's simpler." Marcus was looking at her, not suspiciously, curiously, and I let it rest there. After dinner, while Marcus was in the kitchen helping me with the dishes, something he's done since he was 8 years old, a habit that survived every phase of his growing up, I said very quietly, "I need to show you something before the wedding. Not to hurt you, because I am your father and I love you, and that is the only reason." He didn't say anything. He kept drying the same glass for a moment longer than it needed. Then he nodded. I showed him the report on a Thursday evening at my office. I had printed it and placed it in a plain folder, the way I used to prepare client documents. I sat across from him the way I'd sat across from clients for 30 years. I told him what Gary had found. I told him about Sylvie Marchand, the judgment, the unsatisfied debt, the ex-husband's warning, the 5-year age discrepancy, the exaggerated employment history. Marcus was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "Maybe she had reasons for the name change that aren't what this looks like." I said, "Maybe. And she can tell you those reasons. But Marcus, she has had 14 months to tell you those reasons on her own. She didn't." He said, "The judgment could be disputed." I said, "It was litigated. It wasn't disputed. It was simply never paid." Another silence. Then, Letourneau, her ex-husband. He said to be careful about what I sign. "Yes. I've already signed things, Dad. We opened a joint account. I put her name on the lease for my condo." I looked at my son. He was 33 years old, and he looked, in that moment, about 14. He looked the way he'd looked the morning we told him about his mother's diagnosis, that particular quality of a person recalculating everything they thought they knew. I said, "That's why I'm telling you now, and not after the wedding." He took the folder. He went home. He didn't call me that night, or the next morning. I sat with the silence of the house and thought about Patricia and hoped, with everything I had, that I had done this the right way. He called me on Saturday. He said, I asked her directly, about Longueuil, about the name. What did she say? She said the name change was, because of the judgment, she wanted a clean start. She said she was ashamed of it and she was planning to tell me before the wedding. And the age? A pause. She said she'd felt self-conscious about being 36 and unmarried when she met me, that it was just vanity. I said, "What does your gut tell you, Marcus?" Long silence. "I don't know," he said. "I honestly don't know. 2 months ago I would have said I knew everything I needed to know about her. That change," I said, "is information." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, what do I do with the joint account?" And I understood then that he had already made a decision, even if he hadn't said it yet. When a man asks his father what to do with a joint account, instead of asking what to do about a wedding, the wedding is already over in the part of his mind that is still connected to his own instincts. "You get independent legal advice," I said. "Today, if you can. And you don't sign anything else until you have it." The wedding was postponed. Marcus announced it to the family as a scheduling matter, venue complications. Nothing serious. He and Simone continued to live together for another 6 weeks. which was one of the hardest things I've watched my son endure, because he is not a person who knows how to be in a room with someone he's stopped trusting. He doesn't have a face for it. During those 6 weeks, 3 things happened. First, Marcus's real estate lawyer reviewed the joint account documentation and found that the account had been established with signature authority language that was broader than standard, meaning Simone had the ability, under the existing agreement, to initiate wire transfers without secondary authorization above a certain threshold. His lawyer advised him to restructure the account immediately, which he did. Second, Gary confirmed that the ex-husband François Letourneau had, during the marriage to Simone, Sylvie, co-signed a loan that had subsequently defaulted. Letourneau was still carrying consequences from that default. The words, "Be very careful what you sign," had not been vague. Third, and this is the part I find myself thinking about most often, Marcus came to my house on a Sunday afternoon, and we sat in the backyard the way we used to in summers when he was a teenager, and he said, "When did you know? With Mom? How did you know she was the right person?" I said, "Almost immediately." But that's not the useful answer. The useful answer is that your mother never made me feel like I needed to protect myself from finding out who she really was. Marcus was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Simone makes me feel like every conversation is a negotiation." I said, "Yes." He said, "I think I've known that for a while." I said, "Yes." He broke off the engagement on a Tuesday evening. He did it quietly and without involving me, which was appropriate. It was his life to manage, and he managed it. Simone moved out within a week. She did not contest the joint account restructuring. She did not demand anything from the condo lease. She simply left, with the same composed efficiency with which she had arrived, and I thought, yes, someone who has done this before knows how to exit cleanly. It is now 14 months since that Tuesday evening. Marcus has done what I hoped he would do. He has been honest with himself about what the relationship was and what it cost him, and he has not let it make him either permanently closed or permanently naive. He calls me every Sunday evening. We have dinner together once or twice a month. Last spring, he started coaching a youth hockey team in his neighborhood, which is something his mother would have loved. He has not yet met someone new. That's fine. There's no timeline for that kind of thing. Some things take exactly as long as they take. The Stony Creek property is still co-owned between us. The asset protection structures I put in place before any of this happened are still in place, because that kind of careful management doesn't stop being a good idea just because the immediate threat has passed. Patricia and I built what we built slowly and carefully, and my job now is to make sure it passes to my son intact and eventually to whatever family he builds on his own terms, in his own time, with someone who has no reason to hide from the question of who she really is. I want to say something directly to anyone who is watching this and recognizing something in this story. I am not telling you that suspicion is love. It isn't. And I'm not telling you that every partner who has a complicated past or a difficult history is a threat. That's not true either. And it would be a cold and unfair way to move through the world. What I am telling you is this. The people who love you do not ask you to stop asking questions. They don't need a clean slate so badly that they build one out of a different name. They don't establish financial arrangements that give them options they haven't told you about. And when someone in your life, someone who has known you your whole life, who has no motive except your well-being, tries to show you something difficult, the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to look at it, even when looking is hard. My son did that. It took courage. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that makes a good scene in a film, but the ordinary grinding kind of courage that it takes to look at something you don't want to see and say, "I see it." That kind of courage is available to everyone. And it is, I believe, the most important thing a person can teach their child, not to be guarded against the world, but to stay honest with themselves inside it. Marcus is going to be fine. More than fine. He is 34 years old, and he knows something now that a lot of people don't learn until it costs them much more than a postponed wedding and a restructured bank account. He knows what it feels like when someone is performing love instead of giving it. He will not make that mistake again. Not because he'll be suspicious of everyone, but because he knows in his body, in the way you only know things that have actually happened to you, the difference between a relationship where you can be fully known and one where you are only ever seeing what someone needs you to see. That knowledge is worth everything it cost. I looked at my watch that evening at the dinner table. I was checking the time, checking how much of the evening was left, how many more careful questions I could ask before the moment passed. Outside, it was February in Hamilton. The temperature had dropped below -15. The streets were quiet the way Ontario streets get quiet, when it's genuinely cold, not deserted, just settled. Every person exactly where they chose to be. Inside, the candles on the table were burning low. Marcus was refilling Simone's wine glass. She was thanking him with that particular smile. And I thought about my wife. About the way Patricia used to say that the truth doesn't need to be rushed, it only needs to be allowed. That if you create the right conditions, and you stay patient, and you ask the right questions at the right moments, the truth will always find its way to the surface. She was right. She was right about most things. I put the folded napkin in my pocket, and I smiled, and I said something pleasant about the salmon, and I waited.